The afternoon rush at Central Station was nothing special. Just another Tuesday where thousands of people moved through the massive building like water flowing through a river. Some were heading home from work, others were catching trains to visit family, and a few tourists stood around looking confused at the departure boards. In the middle of all this chaos sat a small cafe, the kind you'd find in any train station. The coffee was average, the pastries were okay, and nobody really came here for the atmosphere. They came because they needed caffeine or a place to sit for 20 minutes before their train arrived. At a corner table, away from the main flow of foot traffic, sat an old woman. She looked like she could be anyone's grandmother. Her clothes were clean but worn, the kind you'd wear to run errands or take a bus across town. A faded blue scarf covered most of her gray hair, and she held a simple shopping bag on her lap like it contained something precious. Maybe groceries, maybe just some personal belongings. Nobody bothered to wonder. She had ordered a single cup of tea about 40 minutes ago and was making it last. The cup was probably cold by now, but she kept her weathered hands wrapped around it anyway. Her eyes would occasionally drift across the station floor, watching people rush by, but mostly she kept to herself. Invisible. Just another elderly person with time to spare. The station had installed a beautiful grand piano 6 months ago. It was part of some community art project, something about bringing music to everyday life. The idea was that anyone could sit down and play, share their talent with strangers, create moments of beauty in the middle of ordinary days. The reality was less inspiring. Most days the piano sat silent. When someone did play, it was usually brief and awkward. That afternoon had been no different. A businessman had stopped and played a clumsy version of Happy Birthday, probably practicing for a party later. A teenager had banged out a pop song she barely knew, giggling with her friends. A music student had attempted something classical but gave up halfway through, frustrated with the public setting. The piano was beautiful, though. Black and glossy, sitting there like an invitation that nobody quite knew how to accept. It had become just another piece of furniture in the station, something people walked past without really seeing. The station manager was having a bad day. His name was Robert, and he'd been the one who pushed for the piano installation. He'd imagined wonderful performances, viral videos, people stopping their busy lives to appreciate art. Instead, he got choppy renditions of chopsticks and uncomfortable silences. His supervisor had asked him that morning if the piano was really worth the floor space. Robert grabbed the microphone at the information desk. His voice crackled through the station speakers, competing with train announcements and general noise. Good afternoon, everyone. We have this beautiful piano here in our station, and we'd love for someone to play. If anyone out there can truly play, please, give our travelers something special to hear. Don't be shy. A few people glanced toward the piano. Most kept walking. The old woman in the cafe looked up briefly, her eyes resting on the instrument for just a moment longer than seemed casual. Then she went back to her cold tea. 5 minutes passed. Robert tried again. Really, anyone? We'd be so grateful for some real music today. This piano is here for you, for all of us. Won't someone play? The desperation in his voice was starting to show. A couple of commuters exchanged amused looks. The barista in the cafe smiled sympathetically. Everyone had seen Robert's enthusiasm about the piano over the past months, and everyone had watched it slowly fade into disappointment. The old woman shifted in her seat slightly. Her fingers resting on the table beside her teacup moved almost imperceptibly, not quite tapping, but responding to something only she could hear. An internal rhythm, maybe. A memory of something. The cafe was busy now with the late afternoon crowd. People ordered their drinks in hurried voices, checking their watches, scrolling through their phones. The woman's table was small and tucked away, but eventually the cafe got crowded enough that people had to share space. A young girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, approached with her mother. The mother was juggling shopping bags and a coffee while trying to find a seat. "Excuse me," she said to the old woman. "Would you mind if we shared this table? Everything else is full." The old woman smiled warmly and gestured to the empty chairs. "Please sit." The little girl climbed into the chair directly across from her. While her mother got settled and checked her phone for their train time, the girl studied the old woman with the unfiltered curiosity that only children have. She noticed the woman's hands especially. "You have interesting hands," the girl said suddenly. Her mother looked up, slightly embarrassed. "Sweetie, that's not polite." But the old woman just laughed softly. It's okay. What makes them interesting? The girl tilted her head. They look strong but gentle, like my Nana's hands. She used to play piano before she got too old. Do you play piano? The question hung in the air for a moment. The old woman's smile became something more complicated, touched with memory and perhaps a bit of sadness. I used to, she said quietly. You should play that one, the girl said, pointing toward the grand piano visible through the cafe's glass partition. That man on the speaker keeps asking for someone to play. You could do it, the woman shook her head gently. Oh, I don't think so. That's for other people. Why? The piano doesn't care who plays it. It just wants to make music. The mother finally looked up from her phone, noticing the conversation. I'm sorry, she's very forward sometimes. No, the old woman said. She's lovely. She looked at the girl again, really looked at her, and something seemed to shift in her expression. Your grandmother, she taught you about piano? The girl nodded enthusiastically. She said music is like magic. It can change how people feel. She said a good piano player can make sad people happy and lonely people feel less alone. Do you think that's true? The old woman's eyes glistened slightly. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I think that's very true. Robert's voice came over the speakers again, one last try. Last call for any pianists out there. We'd be so grateful. Please, won't anyone play? The little girl looked at the old woman hopefully. She didn't say anything more, but her expression was a question all by itself. The woman sat very still for a long moment. Around her, the cafe buzzed with noise and movement. People living their separate lives, all packed together in this temporary space. None of them connected, none of them really seeing each other. Just bodies moving through a building, trying to get somewhere else. Then slowly the old woman set down her teacup. She carefully removed her blue scarf and folded it, placing it on the table. Her gray hair, now visible, was pulled back in a simple bun. She stood up, and there was something about the way she rose that suggested a different person than the one who had been sitting there invisible for the past hour. The little girl beamed. Her mother looked surprised. The old woman picked up her shopping bag and began walking toward the piano. Her steps were steady despite her age. A few people in the cafe noticed her moving and watched with mild curiosity. Another amateur about to embarrass themselves, probably. She reached the piano and stood beside it for a moment, one hand resting lightly on its polished surface. She was remembering something, anyone could see that. The question was what? The old woman stood beside the piano for what felt like forever but was probably only 10 seconds. Her hand remained on the smooth black surface, fingers spread slightly as if greeting an old friend. People walked past her, some glancing over with mild interest, others completely oblivious. Just another person standing near the piano, probably working up the courage to play Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. She pulled out the bench and sat down slowly, adjusting her position with small, precise movements. The way she did it was different from the others who had played that day. The businessman had just plopped down carelessly. The teenager had perched on the edge like she might jump up and run away at any moment. But this woman settled in like she was finding exactly the right spot, the way you'd adjust a picture frame until it was perfectly level. In the cafe, the little girl pressed her face against the glass partition, watching intently. Her mother had started to pay attention too, phone now forgotten on the table. A few other cafe customers turned their chairs slightly to get a better view. The woman placed her hands on the keys but didn't press down yet. She closed her eyes and took a slow, deep breath. It was the kind of breath you take before doing something important, something that matters. Around the station, life continued its normal rhythm. A train announcement echoed overhead. Someone dropped coins at a ticket machine. A baby cried somewhere in the distance, then she began to play. The first few notes were soft, almost questioning. They floated out into the station like whispers, tentative and gentle. A businessman walking by slowed his pace slightly but kept moving. A woman checking her phone looked up briefly. Nothing too dramatic yet, but something was different about these sounds compared to what had come from that piano earlier in the day. The woman's fingers moved across the keys with unusual grace. Even in these opening moments, you could tell this wasn't someone who had learned piano as a hobby or taken a few lessons as a child. This was different. The notes weren't just being played, they were being shaped, given life and meaning. As the piece continued, something started to happen in the station. The change was subtle at first. Like the way a room gradually gets darker at sunset before you realize you need to turn on a light. Conversations began to fade. People who had been walking with purpose started to slow down. Heads turned toward the source of the music. The woman's eyes were still closed, but her whole body had begun to move with the music. Not dramatically, not like she was performing for an audience, but naturally, the way a tree sways in wind. Her shoulders rose and fell. Her head tilted slightly. She was somewhere else now, somewhere beyond the train station, beyond the afternoon crowds, lost in whatever world the music was creating. A young couple who had been arguing near the departure board stopped mid-sentence. The man who had been gesturing angrily about something let his hand drop to his side. They both turned toward the piano, their disagreement suddenly forgotten or at least postponed. The piece was building now, becoming more complex. The woman's left hand provided a steady foundation, while her right hand began to dance across the higher keys, creating a melody that was both melancholic and beautiful. It was the kind of music that made you think of things you'd forgotten, memories you didn't know you still had. In the cafe, people had stopped ordering. The barista stood frozen with a cup in his hand, forgetting to pass it to the customer waiting. Nobody seemed to mind. They were all listening now, really listening. The little girl who had encouraged the woman to play was completely still, her eyes wide. "Mom," she whispered, "she's really good." Her mother didn't respond, couldn't respond. She was transfixed. Something about this music was reaching into a place most people keep carefully locked away during their daily routines. The place where emotions live, where beauty matters more than schedules and train times. More people were gathering now. A small crowd had started to form around the piano, keeping a respectful distance but drawn by the sound like moths to light. An elderly man with a cane stopped and leaned against a pillar, closing his eyes to listen. A group of teenagers who had been loud and energetic moments before stood quietly, their phones for once not in their hands. The station manager, Robert, had emerged from his office when he heard the music. He stood at the edge of the growing crowd, his mouth slightly open in disbelief. This was what he had imagined when he'd pushed for the piano installation. This exact moment, music that could stop time and make strangers feel connected to something larger than themselves. The woman at the piano seemed completely unaware of the attention she was gathering. Her fingers continued their dance across the keys, now moving faster, the piece gaining intensity and power. But it wasn't just technical skill on display, though that was clearly extraordinary. It was the emotion behind every note, the way each phrase seemed to tell a story, the way the music swelled and retreated like waves on a shore. A businessman in an expensive suit, the kind of person who looked like he hadn't had time for beauty in years, set down his briefcase and just stood there. A tear rolled down his cheek, surprising him so much that he reached up to touch it, almost confused about where it had come from. A mother holding a fussy toddler found that her child had gone completely quiet, mesmerized by the sounds filling the vast space. The woman looked down at her son's peaceful face and felt her own eyes beginning to water. This was more than just good piano playing. This was something else entirely. The music had a quality that professional musicians spend their whole lives trying to achieve. A kind of direct line from the heart of the performer to the hearts of the listeners, bypassing all the usual barriers that keep people separate and alone. The crowd continued to grow. People were now coming from other parts of the station, drawn by the music or by the sight of so many others standing still in a place usually defined by constant movement. They arrived curious and stayed transfixed. Someone in the crowd pulled out their phone to record, but then hesitated, as if filming might somehow break the spell. They lowered the phone and just watched instead, wanting to be fully present for whatever was happening. The piece moved through different emotions like weather changing across a landscape. There were moments of intense sadness that made people want to look away but couldn't. There were passages of such pure beauty that they hurt in a good way, the way beauty sometimes does when it's real and unfiltered. There were thundering sections where the woman's hands seemed to fly across the keys with impossible speed. Yet every single note remained crystal clear. An older woman in the crowd gasped suddenly, her hand going to her mouth. Her companion looked at her with concern. "What is it?" "I know this piece," the woman whispered, her voice shaking. "This is Beethoven, the Moonlight Sonata, third movement. But nobody plays it like this. Nobody. This woman, whoever she is, she's not just good. She's extraordinary. The whisper spread through the crowd like electricity. People started really looking at the pianist now, studying her profile, trying to understand who this person could possibly be. She didn't look like a concert pianist. She looked like someone's grandmother, someone who should be at home knitting or watching television or doing whatever it is that elderly people do in the afternoon. But her hands told a different story. Those hands had lived a lifetime on piano keys. You could see it in every movement, every precise placement of fingers, every graceful transition from one chord to another. These were hands that had practiced for thousands of hours, that knew this instrument like a native language. The music was racing towards something now, building to what felt like an inevitable climax. The intensity in the station was almost unbearable. People held their breath without realizing it. The world outside had ceased to exist. There was only this moment, this music. This mysterious woman at the piano who had appeared out of nowhere to remind everyone that magic still exists if you know where to look for it. The music exploded into its most demanding section, and suddenly everything else in the station seemed to vanish. The departure board stopped mattering. The trains could wait. Time itself felt suspended, held in place by the sheer force of what was pouring out of that piano. The woman's fingers were moving so fast now that they were almost a blur, yet somehow, impossibly, every single note was perfect, clean and precise and full of intention. This wasn't just technical mastery, though that alone would have been stunning. This was decades of experience compressed into every moment, every phrase, every impossible run up and down the keyboard. Her whole body was involved now. She swayed with the music's momentum, leaning into the dramatic passages, pulling back during the brief, softer moments. Sweat had begun to form on her forehead despite the cool station air. Her face showed intense concentration mixed with something that looked almost like pain. But the good kind of pain. The kind athletes feel when pushing past their limits. The kind artists feel when they're creating something that matters. The crowd had swelled to well over 100 people now. They formed a tight circle around the piano, but nobody got too close. There was an unspoken understanding that this woman needed space, needed air to breathe while she performed this miracle they were all witnessing. In that crowd stood a middle-aged man who had been on his way to catch a train home after a long day at work. He'd been thinking about dinner, about bills, about all the mundane concerns that fill up most people's days. But something about the music had stopped him cold. Not just the beauty of it, though that was undeniable. Something else. Something familiar. He pulled out his phone, not to record, but to search. His fingers trembled slightly as he typed. His wife, standing next to him, noticed his strange behavior. "What are you doing?" "Just watch." "I need to check something," he muttered, his eyes fixed on his phone screen. He was scrolling frantically through search results, comparing images to the woman at the piano. His face grew paler with each passing second. The music thundered on, relentless and magnificent. The piece was notorious among piano students as one of the most difficult in the classical repertoire. It required not just speed but stamina, not just precision but passion. Most professional pianists approached it with trepidation. This woman was playing it like she'd been born to perform it, like the notes were part of her DNA. A young music student in the crowd recognized the piece and was watching with her jaw literally hanging open. She'd been studying piano for 12 years, had given recitals, had won local competitions. She'd tried to learn this exact piece last year and given up after 3 months of frustration. It was too hard, too demanding, too everything. And here was this elderly woman dressed in ordinary clothes, playing it better than the student had ever heard it played outside of professional recordings. Better even than some of those recordings. There was a raw emotion in this performance that you couldn't capture in a studio, a kind of desperate beauty that only comes from playing with your whole heart. The man with the phone suddenly let out a sound, something between a gasp and a shout. Several people near him turned, annoyed at the interruption, but he didn't notice. His hands were shaking as he held up his phone to his wife. "Look," he said, his voice cracking. "Look at this." His wife glanced at the screen, then back at the pianist, then back at the screen. Her eyes went wide. "No," she whispered. "That's impossible. She retired years ago. She disappeared." "It's her," the man insisted, his voice getting louder despite himself. "I'm sure of it. That's Elena Kozlov." The name rippled through the crowd like a stone dropped in still water. People who had been lost in the music suddenly snapped to attention. Those who recognized the name started pulling out their own phones, searching, comparing. Those who didn't know started asking urgent whispered questions to those around them. Elena Kozlov, one of the greatest classical pianists of her generation. Winner of the International Tchaikovsky competition at age 23. Performer at every major concert hall in the world. A woman whose recordings had sold millions, whose technique was studied in conservatories, whose interpretations of the great masters were considered definitive. She had retired suddenly 15 years ago, at the peak of her career, citing exhaustion and a need for privacy, and then she had vanished. No interviews, no public appearances, no explanation. The classical music world had speculated endlessly about what had happened to her. Some said she was ill. Others claimed she'd had a nervous breakdown from the pressure. A few insisted she'd simply gotten tired of fame. And now here she was in a train station, playing for strangers who'd had no idea who she was just moments before. The realization spread through the crowd like wildfire. People were pulling out their phones now, recording, though most were too shocked to even hold them steady. The woman at the piano remained completely focused on her playing, either unaware of the recognition or choosing to ignore it. The music was approaching its climax, the final push that would bring the piece to its dramatic conclusion. Elena's hands flew across the keys with even greater intensity if that was possible. The sound filled the entire station, echoing off the high ceilings, bouncing off the walls, creating a cathedral of music in a place usually filled with only announcements and footsteps. People who had been on their way to catch trains were now pulling out their phones to check the next departure time. They couldn't leave. Whatever they'd been rushing toward suddenly seemed less important than staying for the end of this performance. The station manager stood at the back of the crowd with tears streaming down his face. He'd dreamed of moments like this when he pushed for the piano installation, but he'd never imagined anything quite like what was happening now. One of the world's greatest pianists playing in his station for free, for anyone who happened to be passing by. A security guard who'd been working at the station for 20 years stood with his hand over his heart, completely overwhelmed. He'd seen thousands of people pass through these halls, had helped lost children find their parents, had given directions to confused tourists, had dealt with emergencies and mundane questions. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for this. The little girl from the cafe had somehow made her way through the crowd with her mother. She stood at the front now, close enough to see Elena's face to watch the expressions that flickered across it as she played. The girl understood that she was seeing something special, even if she couldn't fully grasp just how special it was. Elena's performance had transformed the train station into something else entirely. It was no longer just a place of transit, of people rushing from one location to another. It had become, for these few minutes, a concert hall, a sacred space where art was happening at its highest level, where a master was sharing her gift with anyone lucky enough to be there. The music built and built, layer upon layer of sound, each hand doing something different but working together in perfect harmony. It was almost too much, too intense, too beautiful. People in the crowd felt their hearts racing. Some had closed their eyes, unable to watch and listen at the same time, too overwhelmed by the sensory experience, and then, just when it seemed like the music couldn't possibly get any more powerful, Elena threw her entire body into the final passages. Her fingers struck the keys with controlled fury, pulling out sounds that seemed impossible from the instrument. This was music as a physical force, as something you felt in your chest and stomach, not just heard with your ears. The entire crowd was holding its breath now, waiting for the resolution they knew was coming, but couldn't quite believe would actually arrive. The station had never been so quiet and so loud at the same time. Hundreds of people standing in complete silence, listening to music that filled every available space with sound. The final chord was coming. Everyone in the crowd could sense it, could feel the music racing toward its inevitable conclusion like a train speeding toward its destination. Elena's entire being was focused on these last crucial moments. Every muscle in her arms, every tendon in her fingers, every breath she took was dedicated to bringing this piece home with the power and precision it demanded. Her hands struck the keys in a cascading run that seemed to defy physics. The notes tumbled over each other like water rushing down a mountainside, fast and furious but somehow still controlled, still purposeful. This was the moment that separated truly great pianists from merely good ones. The moment where technique alone wasn't enough. You needed something more. Something that couldn't be taught in any music school or conservatory. The crowd was completely still now, barely breathing. A baby that had been fussing earlier was quiet, held close to its mother's chest, somehow sensing that something important was happening. An elderly woman gripped her husband's hand so tightly her knuckles had turned white. A teenager had lowered his phone, forgetting entirely about recording, lost in the moment. Elena's face showed everything she was feeling. Years of performing had taught her to maintain composure on stage, to keep her expression neutral and professional. But this wasn't a concert hall with its formal expectations and rigid protocols. This was a train station, and she was playing for the simple joy of it, for the little girl who had asked her to, for herself and the music she had missed more than she'd admitted even to herself. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she played, mixing with the sweat on her face, but she didn't miss a note. Her hands knew exactly where to go, guided by muscle memory built over 50 years of practice and performance. This piece had been part of her life for so long it was almost like breathing. Difficult, yes. Demanding, absolutely. But also as natural as anything she'd ever done. The music reached its peak, a moment of such intensity that several people in the crowd actually took a step back, almost physically pushed by the force of the sound. Elena's hands crashed down on the keys in the final dramatic chords, each one landing with perfect timing and perfect weight. Not too hard, not too soft. Exactly right, and then silence. Her hands remained hovering over the keys for a moment, trembling slightly from the exertion. The last note hung in the air of the vast station, sustaining and then slowly, gradually fading away into nothing. Elena sat perfectly still, her eyes closed, her chest rising and falling rapidly as she caught her breath. The crowd stood frozen. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The silence after such powerful music felt almost sacred, like the moment after a prayer. Breaking it would feel wrong, disrespectful somehow. 3 seconds passed. 4, 5. Then someone started clapping. Just one person at first, hesitant, almost asking permission. But within a heartbeat, the entire station erupted into applause. It wasn't ordinary applause. This was something else entirely. People were cheering, whistling, shouting. The sound echoed off the high ceilings and walls, bouncing back and amplifying until it was almost deafening. Hands were raised in the air. Strangers were hugging each other. Several people were openly crying, not bothering to hide their tears or wipe them away. The station manager was sobbing, his professional composure completely abandoned. The security guard was clapping so hard his hands were turning red. The music student was shaking her head in disbelief, laughing and crying at the same time. The young couple who had been arguing earlier stood with their arms around each other, their disagreement seeming impossibly small compared to what they'd just witnessed. Elena opened her eyes slowly, as if returning from a long journey. She looked out at the crowd and seemed surprised by their size, by their reaction. For just a moment, confusion flickered across her face. Then understanding dawned. They knew. Somehow they'd figured out who she was. She stood up from the piano bench slowly, using one hand to steady herself. The performance had taken everything out of her. She was 73 years old, and playing that piece was physically demanding even for pianists half her age. But the smile on her face was radiant, genuine, the smile of someone who had just remembered why they fell in love with something in the first place. The applause continued, growing louder if anything. People were calling out to her, "Bravo! Magnificent! Thank you!" The words came in different languages from the diverse crowd. Some people were speaking in languages Elena understood, others in ones she didn't. But the meaning was universal. She gave a small bow, the kind she'd given thousands of times on stages around the world. But this one felt different. There was no spotlight here, no formal stage, no tickets sold or programs printed. Just people who had been going about their ordinary day and had stumbled into something extraordinary. Robert, the station manager, pushed through the crowd, his face flushed with emotion and excitement. "Ms. Kozlov," he said, his voice shaking. "We had no idea. If we'd known you were here, we could have." Elena held up a gentle hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "That's exactly why I didn't say anything," she said softly, her accent still present after all her years performing internationally. "Sometimes the best music happens when nobody knows it's coming." A reporter from a local news station had arrived, having been called by someone in the crowd. She pushed forward with her microphone, her camera operator trailing behind. "Ms. Kozlov, you disappeared from public life 15 years ago. Why are you here? Why now? Why did you play today?" Elena looked past the reporter to the crowd, searching for something. Her eyes found the little girl from the cafe, still standing near the front with her mother. The child was beaming, proud beyond measure that she'd been the one to convince this woman to play. "Because a child asked me to," Elena said simply, "and because I'd forgotten something important. I'd forgotten that music isn't about concert halls or reviews or ticket sales. It's about connection. It's about sharing something beautiful with other human beings, whoever they are, wherever they are." She walked over to where the little girl stood and knelt down to her level, ignoring the protests from her aging knees. "Thank you," she said to the child. "Thank you for reminding me." The girl threw her arms around Elena's neck in an impulsive hug. Elena hugged her back, closing her eyes again, and more tears came. But these were different tears than the ones she'd cried while playing. These were tears of gratitude, of release, of something heavy finally being lifted. When she stood back up, the crowd was still there, still watching, still recording on their phones. Elena knew that within hours this would be all over the internet. Her privacy, the quiet, anonymous life she'd built over the past 15 years, was essentially over. Tomorrow there would be interview requests, probably concert offers, definitely endless questions about where she'd been and why she'd left. But standing there in that train station, surrounded by strangers who'd become an audience by accident, Elena found she didn't mind as much as she thought she would. Maybe it was time to come back, not to the grueling tour schedules or the pressure of perfection, but to the music itself, to sharing it, to remembering why it mattered. The reporter was asking more questions, but Elena wasn't listening anymore. She was looking around at all the faces in the crowd, young and old, rich and poor, locals and tourists. All of them had been touched by the same piece of music. All of them had stopped their busy lives to pay attention to something beautiful. That was what she'd missed. That connection, that moment of shared humanity that only art could create. Someone in the crowd called out, "Will you play again? Please, one more piece." Elena smiled but shook her head. "Not today," she said. "That piece took everything I had. But maybe someday soon." The crowd understood. They didn't push. The applause started again, gentler this time but no less genuine. People began to slowly disperse, though many lingered, not quite ready to return to their regular lives. They pulled out their phones to call friends and family. "You won't believe what just happened," they said. "I was just standing there and then—" Elena retrieved her shopping bag and her blue scarf from the cafe table where she'd left them. The little girl and her mother were still nearby. The little girl's mother approached Elena hesitantly, as if afraid to intrude on something sacred. "I don't know what to say," she began, her voice thick with emotion. "My daughter just wanted someone to play the piano. I had no idea she was asking someone like you. I'm so sorry if we pushed you into something you didn't want to do." Elena reached out and gently touched the woman's arm. "Don't apologize. Your daughter gave me a gift today. She reminded me of something I'd been running from for too long." She looked down at the child again. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Lily," the girl said shyly, suddenly aware of how many people were still watching. "Lily. That's a beautiful name. Tell me, Lily, do you want to play piano like your grandmother did?" The girl nodded enthusiastically. "Mom says we can't afford lessons right now, but maybe someday." Elena was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then she reached into her shopping bag and pulled out a small notebook and a pen. She wrote something down, tore out the page, and handed it to Lily's mother. "This is my phone number. My real one, not any public contact. Call me next week. I have a piano in my apartment that doesn't get played enough anymore. Maybe Lily would like to come visit it sometimes." The mother's hand trembled as she took the paper. "You can't mean—" "You're offering to teach her?" "I'm offering to share music with her," Elena said with a smile. "The way someone once shared it with me when I was about her age. No pressure, no expectations. Just two people who love piano, playing together." She knelt down to Lily one more time. "Would you like that?" Lily's answer was another tight hug, this one even more enthusiastic than the first. Elena laughed, a sound of pure joy that carried across the station. Several people in the remaining crowd smiled at the scene, pulling out their phones again to capture this tender moment. The reporter tried to approach again, but Elena politely held up her hand. "I need to go now. I'm sure you understand." She looked around at the crowd one more time, at all these strangers who had become part of her story. "Thank you all for listening. Really listening. That's the greatest gift you can give a musician." She wrapped her scarf back around her head, though it felt somewhat pointless now that her face would be all over social media within the hour. But old habits die hard, and the scarf felt comfortable, familiar. She picked up her shopping bag and began walking toward the exit. The crowd parted to let her through, but this time it was different from when she'd walked to the piano. Then she'd been invisible, just another old woman in a busy station. Now people reached out to touch her arm gently as she passed, to murmur their thanks, to tell her what the music had meant to them. A young man with tears still on his face said, "My mother died last month. That was her favorite piece. Thank you for playing it." An elderly gentleman bowed his head respectfully. "I heard you perform in Vienna in 1998. I've never forgotten it. And I'll never forget today either." A teenager who looked like she'd never listened to classical music in her life said simply, "That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard." Elena accepted each comment with grace, with a nod or a smile or a gentle touch of her hand on theirs. She was moving slowly through the crowd, not rushing, taking the time to acknowledge each person who wanted to speak to her. This too was part of why she'd left the concert circuit. The constant rushing, the handlers pushing her from one obligation to another. Never enough time to simply be human with the people who loved her music. Robert, the station manager, caught up with her near the exit. "Ms. Kozlov, please, before you go. That piano, it was meant for moments like this. Would you ever consider coming back?"
Not for publicity, not for anything official, just...
"Whenever you feel like playing." It would be an honor. Elena considered this. The old her would have said no, would have protected her privacy at all costs. But something had shifted today. The little girl had cracked open a door Elena had kept firmly shut for 15 years, and now light was streaming through. "Maybe," she said. "I can't promise anything. But maybe sometimes when the mood strikes me, I'll stop by." Robert's face lit up like she'd just given him the greatest gift in the world. "That's more than I could have hoped for. Thank you." As Elena finally reached the station exit, she could hear the buzz of conversation behind her. People were already telling the story to others who had missed it, describing what had happened, pulling up the videos on their phones. By evening, those videos would have millions of views. By tomorrow, news outlets around the world would be running the story. Legendary pianist emerges from retirement for impromptu station performance. She stepped out into the late afternoon sunlight, blinking slightly after the artificial lighting of the station. The city street was busy with normal life. Cars honked. People hurried past. Delivery trucks blocked traffic. The world outside hadn't changed at all, even though something fundamental had shifted inside that station, inside those few minutes of music. Elena started walking down the sidewalk, her shopping bag in hand, looking once again like any other elderly woman running errands. A couple rushed past her, arguing about which restaurant to try. A businessman nearly bumped into her while typing on his phone. They had no idea who she was, what had just happened, what she'd just done, and she found that she liked that. The anonymity was comfortable, familiar after 15 years, but now it felt different. Before, she'd been hiding. Now she was simply choosing when to be seen and when to blend in. That was freedom. Real freedom, not the isolated prison she'd built for herself after retirement. As she walked, she thought about the little girl, about Lily. Teaching had never been something Elena had seriously considered. Her own career had consumed all her time and energy. But now, with that career behind her, maybe passing on what she knew to someone who truly loved music wasn't such a bad idea. Not as a formal instructor with rigid lesson plans, but as a mentor, a friend, someone who could show a child that music was about joy before it was about anything else. She thought about the station, about Robert's invitation to come back whenever she wanted. The idea appealed to her more than she expected. Playing without pressure, without programs to memorize or critics to satisfy, just playing for whoever happened to be there. Maybe that was what music was supposed to be all about. 3 blocks from the station, Elena passed a small cafe with outdoor seating. She was tired from the performance, her hands aching in a way they hadn't in years, her body reminding her that she was 73 and had just played one of the most physically demanding pieces in the piano repertoire. She decided to sit down and rest. The waiter brought her a menu, treating her with the casual politeness you'd give any customer. She ordered tea and a pastry. As she waited, she pulled out her phone, an old simple model she barely knew how to use beyond calls and basic messages. She had no social media accounts, no way to see the storm that was probably already brewing online about her performance. But she could imagine it. She'd been famous once, knew how these things worked. There would be speculation about why she'd retired, demands for her to return to performing, offers for new recordings and tours. The classical music world, which had moved on without her over the past 15 years, would suddenly remember her existence and want to pull her back into its orbit. Elena sipped her tea and smiled to herself. Let them speculate. Let them make their offers. She would do what she wanted now on her own terms. Maybe she'd perform again. Maybe she wouldn't. Maybe she'd make a recording. Maybe she wouldn't. Maybe she'd simply show up at the train station once in a while when she felt like playing, creating magic for whoever happened to be walking by. The important thing, the thing she'd relearned today thanks to a curious little girl and a public piano, was that music didn't belong in a box. It didn't belong only on concert stages or in recording studios. It belonged everywhere, anywhere, whenever someone needed it or wanted to share it. Her phone buzzed. A text message from a number she didn't recognize. She opened it, squinting at the small screen. It was a video, grainy and shaky, taken from someone in the crowd today. She watched herself play, saw the concentration on her face, heard the beautiful sounds filling the station. Below the video was a simple message. Thank you for reminding us that beauty still exists. You changed my day, maybe my life. Elena felt tears prick her eyes again. She set down her phone and looked around the street. All these people rushing by, living their complicated lives, carrying their burdens and dreams and disappointments. How many of them needed a moment of beauty? A reminder that life could be more than just the daily grind. She finished her tea, paid the bill, and stood up. Her apartment was only 2 more blocks away. Tomorrow she would call Lily's mother and arrange that first piano lesson. Tomorrow she would probably have messages from reporters and agents and everyone else who wanted a piece of her time. Tomorrow the world would be complicated again. But today she had played. Really played. For the first time in 15 years she had felt that complete connection between herself, the instrument, and the audience. And it had been every bit as magical as she remembered. Elena adjusted her scarf and continued walking home, a slight smile on her face, her heart lighter than it had been in years.